I heard something knock inside that drawer, but nothing should have been there.
No room, no needle stock, no family key, just a paper folder, and the $2 she had kept beneath the lining of her mother's workbox. And with that money, she bought an abandoned tin sewing needle packet room in New Bedford, Bristol County, Massachusetts. Erased from trade maps in 1979, the north roof had opened along one seam. Rain had buckled the packet room floorboards. The city condemned it on October 3, 2022, with demolition planned for the following spring. Yet, inside the packet crimping drawer, behind a fold plate untouched for 43 years, lay an inheritance precise enough to alter every day ahead. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Rosie Bell had been folding her whole life without knowing it. As a child, she folded grocery receipts into narrow boats outside laundromats, church bulletins into squares beneath uneven table legs, and her mother's paper needle sleeves along softened lines until her thumbs learned where pressure belonged. Their apartment above a fish market smelled of salt, starch, and machine oil. Work came home in brown cartons and left before breakfast. Her mother, Lillian, was a quiet woman with a damaged left wrist and the habit of testing each finished packet against her cheek. If a crimp scratched, she reopened it. If a label leaned, she began again. She never called the work small. On Saturdays, they walked 3 blocks to Aunt Cora Vale's back room behind a dress repair shop on Purchase Street. Cora was not truly Rosie's aunt, though everyone in the garment quarter used the title. She wore a steel thimble on her middle finger and kept 12 needle gauges in shallow maple trays, each slot penciled with a number. The ritual never changed. Cora boiled water for tea, set a wind-up clock for 20 minutes, and gave Rosie one task: sort sharps from betweens, fold the cream papers twice, slide them into tin sleeves, then close each sleeve beneath the hand crimper without bruising the metal. When the clock rang, Cora inspected 10 at random. A crooked fold meant all 10 were reopened. A clean batch earned Rosie 1 molasses biscuit wrapped in wax paper. "Careful work is how poor people keep promises," Cora once told her. Rosie understood only later that the promise was not perfection. It was that another woman's hand would find the right needle when rent depended on finishing a hem before morning. Cora died in February 2019 during a wet snow that blackened at the curbs. Her landlord cleared the room before Rosie could reach it. The maple trays, hand crimper, brass gauge card, and 3 ledgers vanished into an estate auction, listed only as miscellaneous sewing equipment. Rosie kept 1 paper folder Cora had given her, empty except for fold marks and a faint rust-colored circle. After Lillian's death, Rosie moved into her cousin Cora Bell's narrow apartment in Fall River. Cora spoke softly enough that neighbors praised her patience. She kept the pantry key on a red cord, counted slices of bread, and opened Rosie's mail before laying it on the table. When Rosie inherited 6 cartons of needle stock, Cora called them clutter. When repair shops asked Rosie for packets, Cora answered the telephone and said the work had stopped. By late summer, the cartons were gone. Cora claimed storage fees had eaten them. Rosie found the pawn receipt inside a flour tin. The rent envelope disappeared on September 14, 2022. That evening, Cora placed Lillian's chipped blue work cup on the hallway floor beside Rosie's coat. It was the only object she set down gently. Rosie held the pawn receipt and watched Cora turn the deadbolt key around her finger. "You cannot stay here after tonight, Rosie Bell." Exactly 8 words, spoken without heat. On the wall behind Cora, Lillian's photograph leaned inside its frame. One corner slipped loose, her folded hands visible beneath the glass. Rosie waited for Cora to look at it. She did not. That refusal felt cleaner than denial. Rosie placed the paper folder inside her coat, lifted the cup, then left it on the stair because there was no safe way to carry something already broken. For 6 weeks, she moved south and east by the cheapest routes she could find. 2 nights passed beneath the Fall River bus terminal overhang, where the concrete held daytime cold after midnight. In Providence, she slept upright in a hospital waiting room until a guard asked for a patient's name. She gave none and walked to Pawtucket before dawn. $12 became $9 after coffee and a day-old roll, then $6 after a bus to Taunton. She washed in library restrooms, dried her cuffs beneath hand blowers, and kept the folder flat against her ribs. In New Bedford, she slept behind a closed bait shop on MacArthur Drive, listening to halyards strike aluminum masts. Rain reached her shoes. By the 6th week, she owned $2, 1 shortened pencil, and the exact rhythm of Cora's folding table still alive in both hands. The classified ad appeared in the New Bedford Free Public Library on a Wednesday afternoon. Rosie had taken a discarded newspaper to warm her knees when a boxed notice caught beneath her thumb. Municipal line transfer, industrial outbuilding, cash bid, minimum $2. The address was on Rivet Street, near the old textile blocks. Below it, in smaller type, stood the words tin packet room, contents abandoned, structure sold as is. She read the notice 3 times, then copied every line into Cora's folder. The clerk's office would close at 4. Rosie had 41 minutes, no bus fare she could spare, and nearly 2 miles between the library steps and the county annex. She tightened the laces of her wet shoes, placed both dollar bills between the folder's creases, and began walking toward the harbor wind. By the time the clock above City Hall struck 3, Rosie could already see the annex doors closing 1 careful inch at a time. Rosie reached the annex before the doors met. She caught the brass handle with both hands, slipped through sideways, and stood beneath the lobby clock while her breathing settled. The $2 bills had softened with sweat inside Cora's folder. A custodian pushing a gray mop bucket pointed upstairs without asking why she had come. By 4:20, the deed was hers. The property lay farther from the harbor than the notice had suggested. Rosie spent her remaining daylight studying a county road map at the clerk's counter, then accepted a transfer ticket from a woman leaving the building. The bus carried her north along Acushnet Avenue and left her near the city line, 4 3/4 miles from Rivet Street. She walked until the street lamps ended. That first night, she did not reach the building. A cold rain began above Tarkiln Hill Road, thin enough to ignore at first, then steady enough to soak the shoulders of her coat. Beyond a stone wall, she found a hay barn with 1 hinge missing and climbed into the loft through a side door, bowed open by weeds. The temperature fell to 37 degrees. She slept between 2 dry bales with Cora's folder beneath her head, waking whenever mice moved through the rafters or rain struck the loose tin ridge. At dawn, she brushed hay from her hair and walked the final 6 miles. North New Bedford opened slowly around her. A bakery vented warm yeast beside Paquette's pharmacy. Gomes Hardware displayed storm windows behind dusty glass. A narrow diner called Harbor Cup served fishermen beneath green lamps. Across the road stood Ferreira Shoe Repair, its heel-shaped sign turning in the wind, and a former mill office converted into St. Anne's Thrift Exchange. Rosie noticed each place because warm rooms had become landmarks. The county property office occupied one corner of a brick annex between a tax assessor and a room marked Records Storage. Inside, radiators clicked beneath tall windows. A woman with silver hair cut evenly at her jaw sat behind the second counter. One lens of her glasses had a fine scratch across it, and she kept lifting her chin to see below the mark. Her nameplate read, Mrs. Helen Partridge, Deputy Clerk. Mrs. Partridge examined Rosie's wet shoes, the folder, and the 2 flattened bills laid carefully between them. You understand the roof is breached? Yes, ma'am. You understand there is no electricity? Yes, ma'am. You understand the city will not repair it? Yes, ma'am. You understand demolition remains authorized? Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Partridge pressed her lips together and turned toward a metal cabinet. She removed a deed form, a lien transfer certificate, and a receipt book whose carbon sheets had stained her fingertips blue. Rosie signed where the woman tapped. The first signature trembled. The second did not. The clerk placed the papers beneath a brass stamping press. Its handle descended with a slow, mechanical resistance and landed with a sound like a small door closing. $2 received, she said. Rosie watched her slide the bills into the cash drawer. You will follow Ashley Boulevard north, turn east at Phillips Road, then take Rivet Street past the drainage channel. The building is behind the old Button warehouse. The lane has no sign. Mrs. Partridge began folding the deed, then stopped at Rosie's surname. Bell. Rosie looked up. The clerk opened the file again and ran one finger beneath the former owner's name. Cora Vale filed an equipment declaration for that room in 1978. She listed a partner named Lillian Bell. The radiator struck twice. My mother, Rosie said. Mrs. Partridge removed her glasses. Without them, her eyes appeared smaller and less guarded. She told Rosie that Cora had visited the office each January for years, always carrying records tied with cotton tape. The building had belonged to a packet company before Cora leased its rear room for independent piecework. When the textile closures spread through the city, Cora began distributing needles to women sewing from kitchens and spare bedrooms. The tax account eventually fell dormant. After Cora died, no heir answered the notices. She once corrected my coat hem in this office, Mrs. Partridge said, would not accept payment. Rosie touched the edge of the deed. Why was the minimum bid $2? 1, to transfer the lien. 1, to prove someone meant it. Mrs. Partridge opened the drawer again. She placed one bill in the municipal envelope and held the other beneath the desk lamp. Then she tucked it into a narrow space behind the receipt tray. The books can balance tomorrow, she said. Rosie left with the deed inside Cora's folder and precise directions written on the back of an expired tax notice. The road narrowed after Phillips Road. Delivery vans gave way to fenced lots, salt grass, and brick walls, stained by decades of runoff. At the corner of Rivet Street, an elderly man in a canvas cap was pruning dead growth from a chain-link fence. His one-eyed beagle stood beside him, without barking. You looking for the needle place? The man asked. Rosie nodded. He pointed with the pruning shears, past the black walnuts. Dog won't follow. Hates that lane. The beagle sneezed and sat down. 6 walnut trees marked the entrance, their lower trunks dark from rain. Beyond them stood the old Button warehouse, broad and roofless at one end. The packet room rested behind it, like an afterthought built from corrugated tin over a timber frame. It measured perhaps 24 feet wide and 40 feet long. Rust had traveled from every nailhead. A brick chimney leaned slightly west, and 3 roof panels had peeled upward along the northern seam. Above the double doors, a faded sign remained beneath mineral streaks, Vale Bell Needle Packets. Rosie stood long enough for the surname to become real. The chain on the door had already rusted apart. She lifted it from the handles and pushed. One door dragged across the threshold, releasing the smell of wet paper, mouse nesting, iron oxide, and the faint mineral cold of rooms without heat. The front room held a scarred packing table beneath 2 high windows. Her shoes pressed grit into the floorboards. Somewhere inside the wall, water ticked at patient intervals. When she touched the table, the wood felt swollen and furred beneath her palm. A stack of yellowed packet papers rested inside a tin tray, their upper folds curled like dry leaves. The rear room was darker. Rosie found the packet press first, a waist-high machine with a foot lever and 2 iron rollers. Beside it stood the hand crimper, fixed to a bench whose drawers had expanded shut. Empty tins filled 3 shelves. When she moved one, its metallic scrape woke a smell she knew at once. Machine oil, mixed with old paper glue. She tasted dust and rainwater when she breathed through her mouth. The roof opening showed a narrow strip of evening sky. Wind entered there, moved across the rafters, and stirred something beneath the bench. Rosie crouched and found a rectangle of oilcloth, folded around a bundle of paper packets. The cloth was damp at one corner but dry inside. She placed it beside the wall, rather than opening it. By dusk, the temperature had begun falling again. She cleared a space in the front room with a broken broom, pushing tin scraps and plaster chips toward the door. A strip of cardboard became her mattress. The paper folder went beneath her coat at her shoulder. She ate nothing because there was nothing left to eat. In darkness, the building changed character. Roof metal flexed. Water traveled down the chimney with a hollow tapping sound. The packet press gave one quiet click as its cooling iron contracted. Rosie lay awake, learning which noises belonged to weather and which belonged to weight settling through old wood. Near midnight, she reached up and placed one hand against the packing table leg. Its grain was cold, but firm. Someone had worn a shallow hollow into it with the toe of a shoe, perhaps while folding, perhaps while waiting for another stack. Rosie fitted her boot into the mark. It matched. The fold plate had kept what the world had forgotten. For the first 3 mornings, Rosie worked before deciding what the building meant to her. The well stood behind the southern wall beneath a warped cedar cover. She tied a rusted bolt to a length of twine, lowered it until she heard water, then measured 28 feet from the wet mark. The first bucket came up brown with leaves. By the 4th, the water cleared enough to show the dented bottom. She boiled every cup in a coffee tin she found beneath the packing bench. The outhouse leaned beside the drainage channel, its door secured by a leather belt someone had nailed through the latch. Rosie swept out walnut shells, patched the roof with a flattened packet tin, and spread dry lime from a broken sack across the floor. At night she learned the interior by sound. The board beside the chimney complained beneath her left heel. 2 planks near the rear bench clicked together when the air cooled. The center aisle remained silent. On the 4th day, she walked back to Gomez Hardware, carrying the deed beneath her coat. The store smelled of rope, kerosene, and sharpened steel. Rows of wooden drawers rose behind the counter, their brass pulls marked with names written in black ink. The owner, Samuel Gomes, had a white mustache that divided neatly around a burn scar on his upper lip. He listened without interrupting while Rosie explained that she owned a roof with holes, a chimney full of rain, and no money beyond what the clerk had accepted. Samuel looked at the deed, then at her hands. "Cora Vale taught you?" "She taught me packets." That was not my question. Rosie waited. "Yes," she said. He pulled a green account book from beneath the counter. "I can give you 30 days. I cannot promise 30. Then promise honest." She signed her name beneath the heading, Bell, Rosie. Samuel placed a second-hand home repair manual on the counter and pushed it toward her. "That one is free." Previous owner underlined too much. Rosie chose only what would keep the room dry and the chimney safe. A stiff wire chimney brush for $3.85. 30 feet of hemp rope for $1.20, 2 canvas drop cloths at 90 cents each, a tin of stove cement for $1.45, and a used claw hammer for 75 cents. Samuel added a pair of leather gloves with 1 repaired thumb and did not enter them in the book. The chimney took most of the next day. Rosie removed the loose stovepipe, covered the fireplace opening with a damp canvas cloth, and tied the wire brush between 2 lengths of rope so she could work it from both ends. The exterior ladder had lost its fourth rung, so she braced it against the southern eave and climbed with the rope looped around her wrist. From the roof, she lowered the brush through the flue until it stopped 11 feet down. She pulled upward, let it fall, then pulled again. Creosote came loose in hard black scales, striking the covered hearth like handfuls of slate. A bird's nest followed, woven from horsehair, blue thread, and strips of old packet labels. Beneath it, she found a blockage of soot hardened by years of rain. She worked the brush in short turns, poured 1 kettle of hot water along the upper bricks, waited 10 minutes, then scraped again with a bent iron rod. The work lasted 6 hours. By late afternoon, the brush passed from chimney cap to hearth without catching. Rosie sealed 2 cracks in the stovepipe with stove cement and waited until the surface dulled from black to gray. She built the first fire from walnut twigs, shredded packet paper, and 3 pieces of dry pallet wood. Samuel had allowed her to take from behind the store. Smoke rose cleanly. She held one hand above the pipe, feeling heat gather where only damp cold had lived. In the coffee tin, she boiled water with a potato, half an onion, and a spoonful of salt given to her at the harbor cup. The meal tasted faintly of metal. She ate it slowly from Lillian's chipped cup, which she had returned to retrieve from Mara's stairwell, before leaving Fall River. The crack held. That evening, warmth reached the rear workroom for the first time. Rosie began its inventory by wiping each object before moving it. The packet press stood on 4 cast-iron feet, its rollers furred with rust, but unbroken. A brass gauge board hung from 2 square nails, the numbers 6 through 12 still visible beneath grime. 3 shallow sorting trays remained on a shelf, each lined with faded blue felt. A foot-operated tin crimper rested beneath the east window. There was also a paper shear with a 20-inch blade, a glue pot ringed white at the rim, a box of blank gauge labels, and a wooden drying rack, no wider than a chair. The last object was the packing bench. Its upper drawers held paper curls, dead spiders, and 1 child's marble. The lower drawer would not open. Rosie placed both hands around the iron pull and leaned backward. The wood shifted less than a 1/4 inch, then stopped with a dull interior knock, not a scrape, a knock. She emptied the drawer above it and tapped the bottom with the hammer handle. The front half answered hollow. The rear half answered solid. She measured the drawer outside, then slid a wire through the narrow opening. The wire stopped 9 inches before the back panel should have begun. Rosie sat on the floor. Cora had taught her that packet rooms used false bottoms to keep finished labels dry, but this weight was wrong. Paper gave softly when pressed. Tin answered brightly. Whatever sat inside the drawer made no sound until the bench was struck from below. She removed 4 screws from the runner brackets, each buried beneath hardened grease, and lowered the entire drawer to the floor. It was heavier on the left. When she tipped it, something shifted 1/2 inch and settled. Beneath a glued lining of packet paper, she found a cedar disc, no larger than a 1/4, set flush into the inner sidewall. 2 shallow needle holes crossed at its center. Rosie inserted a size 8 sharp through one hole and a size 10 between through the other. The disc turned. A narrow panel released along the underside. Inside lay 6 brown paper parcels wrapped in waxed thread. Rosie carried them to the front room and placed them on the packing table beside the fire. She did not tear the paper. She warmed each knot between her fingers until the wax softened, then drew the thread loose without breaking it. The first parcel held Cora's steel thimble and 3 bone-handled awls. The second contained Lillian's brass gauge card, darkened at the edges, with her initials scratched beside number 9. In the third were 2 packets of unused English sharps, 1 spool of linen thread, and a folding knife whose blade had been sharpened thin from years of trimming paper. The fourth held the maple sorting blocks lost after Cora's death. Rosie pressed her thumb into one familiar hollow. It fitted as her boot had fitted the worn place beneath the table. The fifth parcel was raw material. Sheets of cream rag paper cut to packet width, thin tin sleeves wrapped against rust, and labels for dressmakers in New Bedford, Fall River, Pawtucket, and Lowell. Several names had been crossed out after mill closures. Beside them, Cora had written, "Free stock," in blue pencil. The sixth parcel was a square tin box. Its lid had been sealed with paper tape and stamped twice with the image of a threaded needle. Rosie cut the tape along its original seam. Inside lay a piecework ledger, a cream envelope, and a stack of postal money orders bound by cotton ribbon. She lifted the ledger first. Page after page listed needle gauges, packet counts, dates, and women's names. Some entries carried prices of 12 or 15 cents. Others had no price at all. Next to them, Cora had written, "Mill shut, husband laid off, machine repair, school uniforms, morning dress." The free packets had not been charity in the ledger. They were recorded as work continued. Rosie opened the money orders one at a time. Each had been purchased in small amounts over years, payable to Cora Vale or Lillian Bell, then endorsed but never deposited. She arranged them by date and added them with the shortened pencil from her coat. The first total came to $28,330. She counted again. One $20 order had folded beneath the ledger cover. The final total was $28,150. Beneath the money orders lay a cloth purse containing 4 worn Indian head cents, 12 Mercury dimes, 3 Walking Liberty $50, and 1 1921 Morgan silver dollar. At the bottom rested a victory medal from the First World War, its ribbon faded to smoke-colored stripes. The edge had been engraved with a name and the year 1919. Rosie did not open the cream envelope. She returned the coins to the purse, laid the medal on top, and wrapped the money orders in their cotton ribbon. Outside, evening had settled over the drainage channel. She walked behind the building and sat beneath the black walnuts where the ground sloped toward the Acushnet River. Factory windows held the last light in broken squares. A gull passed low over the water, beating its wings against the wind, then became still enough to glide. Rosie kept the unopened letter inside her coat. She watched the tide turn without making a plan. The fold plate had kept what the world had forgotten. At first light, Rosie carried the cream envelope to the packing table. The paper had darkened around the edges, but the handwriting remained exact, each word leaning slightly forward as if it had somewhere necessary to go. She knew the capital B before she read the name. Lillian had formed it the same way on grocery lists and packet labels, with the lower loop smaller than the upper. Rosie opened the envelope along its old knife cut. "My dear one, whoever you are, if you have found this letter, then you have opened the drawer correctly, which means someone taught you not to force a tool that was made to turn. That is enough for me to trust your hands. My name is Cora Elizabeth Vale." In March of 1978, Dr. Nathaniel H. Mercer at St. Luke's Hospital in New Bedford told me that the weakness in my lungs was pulmonary fibrosis and that I should arrange my affairs. He said 6 months, perhaps a year. Doctors can be exact about illness and mistaken about time. I lived long enough to hide this, close the trade, and watch 3 more winters pass. The packet work came through 4 generations. Abigail Vale began folding papers in Lowell in 1866 after her husband, Thomas, died from wounds carried home from the Civil War. Her daughter Ruth moved the trade to Fall River in 1892 and added tin sleeves for mill dressmakers. Ruth's son Elias opened this room in New Bedford in 1921. I took his place in 1947, and your Lillian Bell came to my table in 1968 with quicker eyes than mine and a wrist that never wasted motion. We closed the trade on October 17th, 1978. For more than 30 years before that date, We gave packets without charge whenever a mill shut, or a household machine was the only wage left. The ledger records those women because free work must still be counted. What is not counted is too easily forgotten. My brother Samuel Vale was killed near the Meuse River in France during the First World War. The medal in the box was sent to our mother in 1919. She kept it beside her paper knife, not because war made him important, but because ordinary work had once been done by his hands. He cut every first label for this room. You will find the old methods stubborn, but they are not difficult. Warm paper glue to 145 degrees and never let it boil. Mix 1 part wheat paste with 3 parts water for rag paper, then wait 12 minutes before brushing. Sort sharps by eye first and confirm every 10th needle against the brass gauge. When crimping a tin sleeve, hold pressure for 4 seconds. Longer marks the metal. Shorter lets damp enter. The money orders belong to the work. Use them to make the roof sound, the chimney safe, and the room honest again. Do not spend them to look prosperous. Prosperity can be purchased for an afternoon. A trade must survive Monday morning. Inheritance is not what rests in a drawer. It is the condition in which you leave the bench, the accuracy of the label, and whether the next woman finds the tool sharpened. If you have no wish to continue this work, then use the room for another careful purpose. But do not mistake quiet labor for a life that failed. Lillian helped me place the fold plate inside the drawer. She asked me to leave the letter open to whoever had patience enough to find it. If you are her child, know that she spoke of you often. She said your hands learned rhythm before your feet learned stairs. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Cora Elizabeth, Vale, November 2nd, 1978. Rosie read the letter twice. On the second reading, her finger stopped where Cora had written, "Your Lillian Bell." She did not press the page to her chest or speak into the empty room. She laid it flat, matched the old creases, and folded it into thirds with the edge of her thumbnail. The paper returned to the envelope without resistance. The letter mentioned a marker behind the southern wall, 3 paces beyond the well. Rosie carried the ledger outside and counted from the stone rim. At the 3rd pace, weeds covered a flat iron plate no wider than her hand. She cleared the soil with the bone-handled awl. A threaded needle had been stamped into the metal. Beneath it, a narrow inscription read, "Work given is work kept." The plate marked a buried conduit running from the workroom wall toward the drainage channel, once used to carry damp air away from the paper stores. Rosie followed its line with the heel of her boot and found the outlet blocked beneath roots and silt. She opened it with the iron rod. Cold water emptied in a dark rush, and somewhere inside the building a trapped pocket of air sighed through the floor. That evening, she cleaned Cora's old glue pot. She heated a thumb of beeswax in its center, twisted linen thread around a scrap of packet paper, and made a wick. The flame rose small and steady, reflected in the pot's white mineral rings. It was not bright enough to fill the room. It made the bench visible. Rosie began to understand the path that had carried her there, through people who had never asked to become part of a story. Mrs. Partridge had hidden $1 behind the receipt tray. Samuel Gomes had trusted her name before her account. The woman at the annex had surrendered a bus transfer without explanation. At Harbor Cup, a waitress named Doris Pike had wrapped a potato and half an onion in yesterday's menu. Even the old man on Rivet Street had stopped cutting dead vines long enough to point her toward the Walnut Lane. None of them had solved her life. Each had moved one obstruction. Before this story goes further, remember one small kindness someone once gave you when they could not know what it would become. Perhaps it was a meal, a ride, a tool, or a door held open at the right hour. Tell us about that kindness in the comments. Small help travels farther than the giver can measure. Rosie placed the thimble, gauge card, awls, metal, and folded letter on the cardboard beside her sleeping place. The money orders remained tied in cotton and locked inside the packet press housing. She lay down with Lillian's brass card beneath her open palm. The candle in the glue pot burned until its wick reached wax. The first snow came on December 2nd and measured 4 inches against the southern wall. Rosie read the roofing chapter 3 times beside the stove, once for sequence, once for measurements, and once with a pencil beneath every word she did not trust herself to remember. The packet room roof measured 24 by 40 feet with a shallow pitch and 1 damaged northern run. She calculated 12 squares of shingles after waste, 3 rolls of felt, and 22 pounds of galvanized nails. Samuel Gomes studied her figures, corrected only the nail weight, then reached beneath his counter. The roofing hatchet he placed beside the account book had a leather-wrapped handle polished dark by another hand. "My brother used it 30 years, he said. "Return it sharp." A retired roofer named Walter Pyers arrived the following morning in a brown wool cap. He had heard about the roof from Doris and refused Rosie's offer of future payment by closing his pocket knife and putting it away. "Money makes apprentices hurry," he said. They worked for 11 days. Walter showed her how to brace the split rafter with a sister board, extending 3 feet beyond each damaged side, then clamp it before driving bolts through both pieces. He snapped a chalk line across the felt, blue dust flashing briefly in the cold, and taught her to set every nail in 3 strokes. 1 to start, 1 to seat, 1 to finish. "That nail's proud." Rosie touched the raised head. "Pull it." By the 6th day, her shoulders shook when she climbed down the ladder. By the 9th, she could trim a shingle valley without tearing the felt beneath it. Walter spoke little except to correct her hands. He accepted coffee, 1 boiled egg, and no wages. They finished on December 14th beneath a white sky. Rosie stood in the workroom during the next rain and listened. Water struck the new shingles, crossed the roof, and left without entering. January exposed what the first fire had concealed. The chimney bricks above the roof line had begun to spall, their red faces loosening into thin shells. Mortar powdered beneath Rosie's thumb. She removed each damaged joint to a depth of 3/4 of an inch, brushed out the dust, and misted the masonry so the replacement mortar would not dry too quickly. Walter advised 1 part hydraulic lime to 2½ parts clean sand for the exterior joints. Around the flue tile, Rosie mixed 1 part fire clay with 3 parts refractory mortar and pressed it into the gaps using the narrow end of Cora's bone-handled awl, only where the steel tuck pointer would not fit. The work took 3 weeks in temperatures that remained mostly in the 20s. Rosie wore gloves while carrying bricks, but removed them to shape each joint. Her bare fingers went numb every 15 minutes. She warmed them around Lillian's cup, returned to the scaffold, and continued before sensation fully came back. One morning, a repaired corner shed its mortar overnight. Rosie scraped it clean and began again without speaking. On January 28th, she built a test fire from dry walnut and watched from outside while Samuel stood at the clean-out door. The smoke climbed vertically from the chimney cap, pale and uninterrupted. Samuel lifted 1 hand through the cold air. "Draws clean." Rosie fed the fire 1 more split. Beneath the dirt, the floor was white pine fastened with hand-cut rose-head nails. Rosie countersank each loose nail before renting a random orbit sander from Gomes Hardware for $14 a day. Samuel made her sign for 2 days and told her to return it before noon on the 3rd. She began with 80 grit paper, moving with the grain and never letting the machine rest in one place. The second pass used 120 grit. The third, slower than the others, used 220 dot. Dust entered the cuffs of her coat and settled along her eyelashes. After vacuuming twice, She wiped the boards with mineral spirits and waited until no dark streak remained. She applied 3 thin coats of tung oil blend with lint-free cloth, allowing each coat to penetrate before removing the excess. The final coat required a 48-hour cure, during which she crossed the room only on 2 planks, laid from door to stove. The color shifted under her hands. What had looked like dull brown opened first to dark honey, then deepened toward mahogany, where generations of shoes had compressed the grain. The worn hollow beneath the packing table remained visible. Rosie did not sand it away. There was one bad morning. She opened the door, saw the sanding dust waiting in the seams, and could not lift the broom. Instead, she walked to the marsh and sat on an overturned skiff. A great blue heron stood in shallow water for nearly an hour, motionless, except for one deliberate step at a time. Rosie watched until it flew. She did no work that day. The following morning, she returned the sander clean, paid $28 from the first redeemed money order, and swept the room from the far wall toward the light. 8 windows remained in the packet room. 3 had no glass. 4 were cracked from corner to corner. The last held an original pane, dated by its rippled surface and square-cut glazing points to 1788, salvaged from an earlier building and fitted into the eastern sash. Rosie left that pane untouched. She removed the damaged glass, labeled every sash, and softened the old putty with warm linseed oil before scraping it free. Samuel supplied salvage panes close enough in thickness to match the originals. For each repair, Rosie rolled DAP 33 glazing putty between her palms until it became pliable, pressed a narrow bed into the rabbet, set the glass without forcing the corners, then secured it with glazing points. She drew the putty knife in one continuous angle along each edge, leaving a clean bevel that shed water beyond the wood line. The counterweights had fallen in 5 windows. Rosie threaded 1/4-inch cotton sash cord over the pulleys and tied each weight with a figure-8 knot, leaving enough tail to tighten under load. The first sash dropped too quickly. She shortened the cord by 1/2 inch and tried again. It stayed wherever she placed it. On the final window, she worked beneath the eastern light while February wind moved through the bare branches. As she smoothed the last putty line, a chickadee landed on the nearest walnut branch. Its claws closed around the thin wood. Rosie held still, with the knife raised. The bird looked through the restored pane, tipped its black-capped head once, then flew toward the marsh. The walls near the chimney were the last to dry. Behind the loosened surface, Rosie found horsehair plaster pressed over hand-split oak lath, each strip narrow and uneven, each gap holding the rough keys that had survived nearly 2 centuries. Her first patch sagged before noon. The second cracked at one corner. The third pulled clean from the lath when she tested it with her thumb. She removed all 3. Samuel brought an old paper bag from the rear of the hardware store. Inside lay clean horsehair, saved from his father's upholstery work. Rosie mixed it into lime plaster until the strands separated evenly, then dampened the lath and began again. The scratch coat went on first and was scored with diagonal lines before it set. The brown coat followed at 3/8 of an inch and cured for 72 hours beneath damp cloth. The finished coat was 1/8 of an inch, drawn smooth with a steel trowel and softened at the edges with a wet brush. When the final patch dried without opening, Rosie rested her palm against it. These patches will hold another 100 years. Doris Pike began leaving paper bags on the doorstep before sunrise. She was a square-built woman with flour permanently caught in the seam of her wedding ring. Each bag held something that could survive a workday: beans in a jar, 2 biscuits, an apple, or the heel of a ham wrapped in butcher paper. Rosie carried coins to the harbor cup after the 3rd delivery. Doris pushed them back across the counter with one flour-marked finger. "Pay me in candles when the shop reopens." Rosie put the coins away. Caleb arrived one Saturday on a red Schwinn bicycle with a splitting maul balanced across the handlebars. He was 16, narrow as a fence rail, with one shoelace replaced by copper wire. Without being asked, he cut the fallen walnut limbs into stove lengths and stacked them beneath the eave, with their bark facing outward. Rosie offered him $2. He shook his head and looked toward the packet room sign. My mother said, about your grandfather. Rosie did not correct the relation. Caleb's mother had probably meant Elias Vale, or Samuel, or another name carried loosely through neighborhood memory. The work mattered more than the branch of the family tree. Reverend Boyd passed each morning at 7:10. He wore a black coat brushed shiny at the elbows and walked with a slight outward turn of the right foot. He never entered unless invited. He tipped his hat from the lane, checked whether smoke rose from the chimney, and once helped Rosie lift a sash weight back into its pocket. Before leaving, he placed 2 fingers against the window frame. Keep these hands steady. 4 words. No sermon. By March, Doris's bags came only twice a week. Caleb appeared whenever the woodpile lowered. Reverend Boyd continued past each morning, his hat lifting at the same place, beneath the walnuts. Rosie postponed the cellar until February 11th. The entrance lay beneath a hatch behind the packet press. 7 granite steps descended to a fieldstone floor, measuring 12 by 15 feet. Water had darkened the lower walls, but the stones remained tight. At the center stood a dressed granite slab, smoother than anything around it, carved with the same threaded needle mark stamped on the fold plate. Rosie brushed the carving clean. She did not lift the slab. Under the 3rd step, her fingers found a small oak box wedged behind loose mortar. The lid opened on 2 brass hinges. Inside rested a key and a tin type wrapped in faded blue cloth. The key was brass, 3 inches long, with a bow shaped like a needle eye, crossed by thread. The tin type showed a young woman standing outside the packet room before the corrugated siding had rusted. She held a paper knife in one hand and wore a dark dress with rolled sleeves. Her mouth was Lillian's. The set of her eyes was Rosie's. On the back, scratched into the metal, were the words, Ruth Vale, daughter of Abigail, age 25, summer of 1903. Rosie carried the key upstairs and placed it on the mantel beside the victory medal. She tried it in the desk, the packet press, the front door lock, and the iron cabinet beneath the sorting trays. It opened nothing. The key remained on the mantel. Rosie did not know what it opened, and for once she allowed an unanswered thing to stay unanswered. Snow withdrew from the north wall in narrow gray bands. The creek beyond the drainage channel grew loud with meltwater. Walnut catkins loosened above the roof, and the marsh changed from iron-colored reeds to the first uncertain green. Rosie opened all 8 windows for 1 hour each afternoon, letting lime, oil, smoke, and winter leave together. She decided not to begin full packet production that spring. The press still needed calibration. The tin stock required testing, and her hands remembered more than they understood. She chose 1 Morgan dollar from the cloth purse, sold it carefully, and used only part of the money for rag paper, wheat paste, blank labels, and 3 modern needle gauges. At the packing bench, she practiced on small samples. She folded, opened, measured, and folded again. The house was patient. So was she. 2 winters later, in December 2024, Rosie completed the first packet she was willing to place beneath the restored sign. She had spent months adjusting the old crimper by fractions, replacing 1 worn spring, polishing the tin guides, and learning how much pressure the new sleeves could take before their edges marked. The finished packet held 12 size 9 sharps, aligned between 2 folds of cream rag paper. Its tin cover closed without bruising. The label read, Vale Bell, Needle Packets, in black ink from a hand-cut block. Rosie tested the crimp against her cheek. It did not scratch. She placed the packet in the center of the maple sorting tray and left it there overnight. In the morning, the paper remained flat despite the cold. She entered the result in Cora's ledger beneath the final old line. December 6, 2024. One packet, kept dry. The interior no longer resembled a room rescued from demolition. The white pine floor held a low sheen. Lime-plastered walls reflected winter light without glare. Sorting trays rested beneath the eastern windows. The paper shear stood sharpened beside the bench, and the restored packet press moved with a clean, downward stroke. Near the stove, Lillian's chipped cup held sharpened pencils. Nothing matched perfectly. Everything worked. The brass key found its lock during Caleb's first visit after his 18th birthday. He had come to replace a split board beneath the walnut nearest the lane. While clearing moss from the trunk, he struck metal with the back of his chisel. Rosie knelt beside him and found a narrow brass plate sunk into the bark's old scar, almost swallowed by 40 years of growth. The plate bore a needle-eye opening. Rosie brought the key from the mantel. It turned once. A shallow iron compartment had been fitted into a hollow, formed where the tree divided. Inside lay oilcloth, then a folded 48-star American flag, and a small envelope tied with linen thread. The note was written by Ruth Vale on October 3, 1918, while Samuel served in France during the First World War. Ruth wrote that the flag had hung in the packet room window for her brother. She had removed it when influenza reached New Bedford, and the room became a place where neighborhood women folded gauze masks between needle orders. If Samuel returned, the flag was to be given back to him. If he did not, it was to remain with the tools until someone understood that waiting was also work. The linen thread broke when Rosie loosened it. She folded the note along its original lines and placed it beside Cora's letter. The victory medal was taken to Rural Cemetery in New Bedford on November 11, 2025, the anniversary of the armistice. Samuel Vale's name appeared on a family stone, weathered nearly smooth, beneath a maple. Rosie laid the medal against the granite for the length of Reverend Boyd's four-word prayer. Then she returned it to the packet room. There was no ceremony beyond that. Of the old coins, Rosie used 4. The Morgan dollar paid for her first practice materials. 1 Walking Liberty $half helped purchase a replacement steel spring for the crimper. 2 Mercury dimes were traded to an antique tool dealer for a packet knife of the proper width after he refused modern money for the difference. The remaining coins went back into the cloth purse. Rosie placed the purse, the money orders not needed for repairs, copies of the ledger, and a new sealed letter inside the drawer compartment. She oiled the cedar disc and tested the crossed needle release twice. On the outside of the envelope she wrote, "For the next one." The shop reopened without an announcement. Doris pinned an index card to the Harbor Cup corkboard, between a notice for piano lessons and a lost orange cat. Hand-folded sewing needle packet sizes. 612 orders by mail, or at the cafe. The first order came from a tailor on Union Street who wanted 3 packets of betweens. The second came from a quilting group in Dartmouth. Within 6 months, Rosie kept a mailing list of more than 40 customers in Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Maine, and Vermont. She accepted only as much work as the room could complete, honestly. Packets still went out free when someone wrote that a machine was the only wage left. Caleb returned the following autumn, carrying a cedar board wrapped in an old blanket. He had carved a sign by hand, copying the faded letters above the door. The first line read, "Vale needle packets." Beneath it, smaller but deeply cut, were 2 new words. And daughters. Rosie ran her thumb through the final. "There aren't any daughters," she said. Caleb leaned the sign against the packing bench. He had grown broad through the shoulders, though the copper wire still tied one work boot. Not yet, he said. They hung it below the original sign without removing the older wood. Caleb drilled the pilot holes. Rosie drove the screws. From the lane, the new words appeared only after a person came close enough to read them. That winter, Rosie began her own letter. She used cream rag paper, Lillian's brass gauge card as a straight edge, and the shortened pencil she had carried through the 6 homeless weeks. She did not know who would open the drawer or whether the room would remain a packet shop after her own hands were gone. She wrote about the roof dimensions, the crimper spring, the moisture that collected beneath the north window, and the exact place where the well rope frayed against stone. She listed the names of Doris, Samuel Gomes, Walter Pyers, Caleb, Mrs. Partridge, and Reverend Boyd. Then she began the first full paragraph. My dear one, whoever you are, she explained that inheritance could arrive looking like damage, debt, or obsolete machinery. She warned the reader not to trust the left sash in heavy wind. She recorded which customers had received free packets and why, because unnamed kindness vanished too easily. Near the end, Rosie added one sentence she had carried through every season of repair. The fold plate had kept what the world had forgotten. She folded the letter into thirds and left it unsealed until spring. At dusk, the packet room windows glowed above Rivet Street. The chimney drew clean. Inside, 12 finished orders waited in shallow trays, each label checked twice, each sleeve closed for exactly 4 seconds. Rosie swept paper trimmings from beneath the bench and sharpened the packet knife for morning. The tin sewing needle packet room waits. It has always waited. Across town, Mrs. Partridge retired from the county office at the end of 2025. When the desk was cleared, her replacement found a single worn dollar bill tucked behind the receipt tray. A note in blue pencil identified it, only as proof that someone had meant it. The bill remained in the drawer.